Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the 5 p.m. podcast. I'm Dan, your resident political enthusiast, and as always, I'm joined by the insightful Tina.
Hey everyone, happy to be here. And today, Dan, we've got a topic that's been making headlines and causing quite a stir in Washington, the debt ceiling.
Oh, this is one of those topics that sounds boring, but when you start looking into it, it gets really intense. I mean, we're talking about the U.S. government potentially defaulting on its debt. It is a big deal.
Right, and it seems like every few years we're back in this same situation. So, for anyone who's a bit hazy on the details, can you give us a quick rundown? What exactly is the debt ceiling?
So, the debt ceiling is basically a limit on how much money the U.S. government can borrow. It's not about new spending, but rather paying for expenses that Congress has already approved. It has been around since 1917. And it gets raised or suspended whenever the government gets close to the limit.
Okay, so it's like having a credit card limit, but for the entire country. If you hit the limit and don't raise it, you can't pay your bills.
Exactly. And if the government can't pay its bills, that's what we call a default. And that has some serious consequences.
I can imagine. So what's the current situation? Why is the House Speaker facing so much pressure over this right now?
Well, House Republicans just put out a plan that ties raising the debt ceiling to some serious budget cuts. We're talking about capping spending for the next 10 years. The Speaker wants to get this voted on soon, but with a slim majority in the House, it's tough to get everyone on board.
So it's not just about raising the debt ceiling anymore. It's become a battle over government spending.
That's what it comes down to. And the Democrats, including President Biden, are saying they want a clean debt ceiling increase, meaning raising it without any conditions attached.
I guess neither side wants to budge. What happens if they can't reach an agreement? What are the risks if the U.S. actually defaults?
Well, according to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, the U.S. could run out of cash to pay its bills as soon as June 5th. If that happens, it could trigger a recession, interest rates could go up, and the global financial markets, well, they wouldn't be happy.
That sounds pretty dire. I mean, we're talking about people's mortgages, car loans, and even the stock market taking a hit.
It's a big deal. And we've been through something like this before. Back in 2011, there was a similar standoff over the debt ceiling.
Oh yeah, I remember that. It was a pretty tense time. What happened then?
It went down to the wire, and even though they reached a last-minute deal, the U.S. credit rating was downgraded for the first time ever. It caused a lot of market volatility.
So it's like a cautionary tale. It shows that even if they avoid a default, the uncertainty alone can have consequences.
Exactly. And that's why there's so much pressure on the House Speaker to find some common ground. But it seems like it is easier said than done when the two parties are so far apart.
So what are the chances they'll actually reach a deal this time? Are there any signs of compromise?
It's hard to say. Both sides seem pretty dug in right now. But there are always negotiations happening behind the scenes. I wouldn't count them out just yet.
I guess we'll have to wait and see. It is interesting you brought up that in 2023 there was also a debt ceiling negotiation.
Yes, and it is interesting how similar the situation is. Republicans wanted spending cuts then too. However, I think the economy is in a slightly different position now, which might make things even harder.
That is very true. So is there any way to prevent this from happening again and again? Like, is there any talk of reforming the whole debt ceiling process?
Oh yeah, there are people who argue that the debt ceiling should be abolished altogether. They say it's an arbitrary limit that just creates these periodic crises.
That's an interesting idea. But I can also see how some might argue that it's a necessary check on government spending.
Right, it's a complicated issue. There are valid arguments on both sides. But one thing's for sure, the current system creates a lot of unnecessary drama.
Well, Dan, this has been enlightening. As always, you've given us a lot to think about. I guess all we can do now is hope that lawmakers can find a solution before it's too late.
Fingers crossed, Tina. And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the 5 p.m. podcast. We'll be back next week with more deep dives into the world of politics.
Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and try not to stress too much about the debt ceiling. See ya!